this bill to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr Speaker.
I call the Honourable Member Moana Maki.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, only a national government could pass a piece of climate change legislation that will actually see our gross greenhouse gas emissions as a country dramatically increase. Because apparently on Planet Key, not only are there plentiful golf courses, but on Planet Key, an ETS that will result in mass deforestation, the death of the carbon forestry sector, and increasing gross greenhouse gas emissions. Apparently on Planet Key, that makes good environmental and economic sense. Well, it doesn't at all, and Labor will be opposing this bill all the way through. Now, what people I think need to realise, and what the Minister clearly doesn't understand, is we no longer have an emissions trading scheme once this law is passed. We have a fig leaf. A fig leaf. That's all we have. And I want to comment on the process as well, because this bill, instead of going to Select Committee for what should have been 4 to 6 months, went to Select Committee for 7 weeks. 7 weeks. Now, the Minister did take on some consultation before the Select Committee process, but he didn't consult with environmental organisations, he didn't consult with opposition parties, he didn't consult with concerned New Zealanders, and in fact there was a lot that ended up in the legislation that wasn't actually part of the consultation. So the Select Committee process was a rubber stamping exercise from start to finish. And I do want to thank the officials who worked on that bill, because they were put under really unfair time pressures and time constraints. Mr Speaker, one of the things that this bill does is it extends indefinitely the subsidies the government has put in place for greenhouse gas polluters, and it removes indefinitely agriculture from the scheme. And I want to start with agriculture. New Zealand's ETS is designed to be an all sectors, all gases scheme. It does not work if all sectors and all gases are not in the scheme. Now, when agriculture represents half of New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions, and the government says they are never going to come into the scheme, then the ETS simply doesn't work. And the government needs to ask itself whether or not, in that case, the ETS is actually an appropriate instrument for dealing with New Zealand's climate change commitments. If they want to keep agriculture out, that's their choice. But in that case, this ETS is not the instrument that is going to help New Zealand meet its targets and the government's own targets. And I want to be quite clear, because the reason they say they're keeping agriculture out is because the cost would make agriculture uncompetitive. Well, let's talk about that, because no one is suggesting that agriculture face the full cost of its emissions on day one of entering the emissions trading scheme. Under the Labor government's proposal, which was a lot tougher than the national government's, at a carbon price of $10, the average dairy farm, a typical dairy farm in New Zealand, would have an annual cost, or would have had an annual cost of around $1,000. $1,000 per year per typical dairy farm under the Labor government scheme, and that's at a carbon price of $10. As of this morning, UN offset units could be purchased for $1. $1. So if the government were to bring agriculture into this scheme, under this piece of legislation, with their 2-for-1 surrender subsidy, where UN offset units can be purchased for $1 and then subsidised a further 50% because of the 2-for-1, we were looking at an average cost to a typical dairy farm of $57 a year. Now, if the agriculture sector is going to be driven overshore and made uncompetitive by an annual charge of $50 a year, then I would suggest the agriculture sector has much bigger problems than the price of carbon. And they do. It's called an uncompetitive exchange rate. And if the government was really serious about helping agriculture, they would do what Labor and the Greens have been talking about and look at monetary policy and the tools the Reserve Bank has for helping to control an uncompetitive exchange rate. This is not going to destroy the agriculture sector in New Zealand, and agriculture should be coming into the scheme. Now, Federated farmers often make the point, and it's a fair point, that the agriculture sector are already paying through fuel and electricity, are already paying a carbon cost. That's true. Well, I want to know why Federated farmers aren't holding this government to account and asking why the benefits of the low carbon price, as well as the benefits of the government's transitional subsidies, why are they not being passed on through fuel and energy prices? Because they aren't. And the Minister confirmed that today. He said he just went out and asked random man on the street in Tauranga whether or not fuel and energy carbon prices, the benefits of the low carbon price were being passed on through petrol pump and in energy prices. He must have been talking to John Banks, as that man on the street, because it's not. And I want to read to the Minister the submission that we got from Gull. And what they said was, quote, Gull notes that when it tended to make fuel purchases from opposition oil company terminals in the Wellington region as recently as October 2011, one of the companies priced carbon at $25 per tonne, despite the market at that point being at $14 per tonne. This $11 per tonne difference between response to tender and actual market approximates to 1.5 cents per litre. Note, if the same deal was offered now, with the market at under $7 per tonne, the effective price difference would be 2 to 3 cents per litre. That's for the consumer. Well, the price now is $1. And no one seriously believes that those benefits are being passed on to consumers. They simply are not. And why is that important? Because this bill has serious implications for the forestry industry in New Zealand. And there are two things that affect the forestry industry. One is what the bill does, and one is what it doesn't do. Now, Mr McLeay can roll his eyes, but I know the forestry industry and his electorate are very, very angry about this piece of legislation, as they told me when I recently visited them. Now, the first thing it does is it restricts the market for New Zealand forestry units, because now agriculture doesn't have to purchase any units to offset their emissions, and those who do have to purchase units only have to purchase half because of the 2-for-1 surrender obligation subsidy. So suddenly there's a much smaller market for these credits. Now, that's not what the national government promised the forestry industry when they were elected in 2008. They said they were going to support them, they said agriculture was going to come into the scheme, and they didn't talk about all these subsidies. And the second thing is what the bill doesn't do. And what the bill doesn't do is put any restriction on the UN offset units, which are currently priced at $1. And I don't know if the minister who is in charge of this bill and who spoke in the second reading understands that there is no international price of carbon and that there is no international market. There are a series of schemes which have their own units, and we accept all of them in New Zealand. Now, all those other schemes that are currently being planned or currently in place have restricted these units. So what they've said is that a percentage have to be domestically sourced from within their own scheme, and then people can go outside of the scheme. There are further restrictions. For example, Australia, the next 35% can only be sourced from Europe or Australia. So only 12.5% in Australia will be able to come from these UN offsets, which are currently priced around $1. So all this talk about how we just need to leave the market ignores the fact that there is no market, and I'm not sure that the minister who answered questions in question time today, or who spoke on the second reading, actually understands that that is the case. Because the problem we have is New Zealand's gross greenhouse gas emissions are increasing. Now, the government are going to get up and say, well, you know what, we've met our Kyoto targets, we're on track. Well, yes, we have, only because of the forestry sector. Only because they planted enough trees to offset our growing emissions that we met the target. If they are not there, we are in serious, serious trouble. And we have the added problem that the forests that were planted in the 1990s are due to be harvested in 2020, the wall of wood, as it's so called. That is coming down. Because of the long lead-in time for forestry, it takes a couple of years to secure the investment, go through the consenting phases. Then it takes 4 to 5 years for trees to start sequestering carbon at any real rate. We need to be planting and planting trees and forests now in order to undercut that wall of wood coming down, and that is going to be very difficult even without this piece of legislation. So this bill is devastating for the carbon forestry industry, and I really hope that Peter Dunn does a little bit more consultation beyond the National Party on his position, because I understand that he can vote against the bill, vote for the bill. That's in line with his party policy, that's fair. But he can still support the amendment in my name that would restrict international units, and that would not be out of step with his own party policy, and it would be literally a lifeline for the carbon forestry industry. And he needs to talk to more than Tim Grosser on this issue. He needs to talk to the very foresters who are going to be laying people off and shutting down and exiting the ETS before he puts his vote in this House to kill off the carbon forestry industry in New Zealand. And you know what's even more bizarre about this? This restriction of international units, which they're battling against so hard now in the National Party, is that Tim Grosser promised he would do this in April. In a speech to the Climate Change iwi Leaders Group in April this year, he said, quote, "The government also proposes to enable in legislation the introduction of a mechanism that would place a restriction on the proportion of international units a participant can surrender to meet their ETS obligations. Under current settings, there is a serious danger of New Zealand essentially exporting capital for no good reason, resulting in a loss of economic welfare." Now, that's very true, and the mechanism does exist. When will it kick in? If the government is saying that at some point they will intervene, we currently have an effective carbon price of 50 cents. You can buy UN offset units for $1. The government will subsidise you 50%. That's 50 cents. How much lower can the carbon price go before this government intervenes and realises that they need to live up to the promises that Prime Minister John Key made to the forestry sector back in 2008?
I call the honourable member Todd McLean.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. It is a pleasure.